Sarah Mitchell had always imagined her wedding day would be filled with white roses and happy tears. She never thought it would begin with rough hands dragging her from her bedroom window at dawn, or that she would end up tied with thick rope in the back of a rusty minecart, her wedding dress torn and dirty. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls. Sarah was getting ready for work at the local library when she heard glass breaking downstairs. Her parents had already left for their daily walk, and the house felt too quiet. She tiptoed to her bedroom window to look outside and saw 3 men in dark clothes walking around the house. Before she could scream or hide, the bedroom door crashed open. A tall man with a scar across his left cheek grabbed her arm. "You're coming with us, lady. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah tried to fight back, but there were too many of them. They tied her hands behind her back and put a cloth over her mouth. One of the men threw her over his shoulder like a sack of flour and carried her outside to a waiting truck. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah mumbled through the cloth, but nobody answered her questions. The truck ride felt like hours. Sarah bounced around in the back while the men talked in low voices about someone called the boss and something about money her father owed. She tried to remember if her dad had any enemies, but he was just a quiet man who fixed watches for a living. When the truck finally stopped, Sarah found herself at an old abandoned mine on the outskirts of town. The wooden structures looked ready to fall down at any moment. Rusty equipment lay scattered everywhere, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. The man with the scar, who seemed to be the leader, pulled Sarah from the truck. "Welcome to your new home, princess. Hope you like the view." They dragged her into the main building of the mine. Inside, it smelled like old metal and decay. Water dripped from somewhere in the darkness, making echoing sounds that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Put her in the cart," the leader said. "She's not going anywhere from there." The mine cart sat on old tracks that led deep into the mountain. It was made of heavy metal and looked like it had been there for 50 years. The men lifted Sarah and dropped her inside, then tied more ropes around her ankles and wrists, connecting them to metal rings on the cart's sides. "Please," Sarah said when they removed the cloth from her mouth. "What do you want? My family doesn't have much money." The leader laughed. "Your daddy never told you about his gambling problem, did he? He owes some very important people a lot of cash. You're going to help him remember to pay up." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had noticed her father acting strange lately, staying up late and looking worried all the time. Her mother had mentioned that some of their savings had disappeared, but Sarah thought it was just business problems. "How much does he owe?" she asked. $50,000, the leader said, "and the interest keeps growing every day." Sarah couldn't believe it. $50,000 was more money than her family had ever seen. Her father's watch repair shop barely made enough to pay their bills each month. "He doesn't have that kind of money," she said. "Then he better find it quick," the leader replied, "because you're staying here until he does." The 3 men left Sarah alone in the minecart as darkness fell outside. She could hear them talking and laughing in another part of the building, but she couldn't make out their words. Every few hours, one of them would come check on her, bringing a little water or a piece of bread. Sarah tried to work on the ropes, but they were too tight, and the men had done a good job tying them. The metal cart was cold against her skin, and her wedding dress offered little protection from the mountain air. On the second day, a different man arrived at the mine. Sarah could hear him arguing with the others about something. His voice was deeper and more serious than the others. "You idiots grabbed the wrong girl," the new man said. "Sarah Mitchell isn't even related to the person we're after." Sarah's heart jumped. Maybe this was all a mistake and they would let her go. But the leader's voice came back angry and defensive. "No way, boss. Her old man definitely owes the money. I checked the address myself." "There are 2 watch repairmen in this county," the boss said. "You grabbed the daughter of Samuel Mitchell. The man we want is Stuart Mitchell, no relation. He lives 20 miles south of here." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. They had kidnapped her because of a simple name mix-up. She wanted to scream and tell them they were wrong, but she was afraid they might hurt her if she caused trouble. "So what do we do with her?" one of the other men asked. "We can't just let her go now," the boss said. "She's seen our faces and knows where we are. We'll have to think of something else." That night, Sarah lay awake in the mine cart, listening to the men argue about what to do with her. Some wanted to move her to another location. Others thought they should demand ransom money from her real father, even though he had nothing to do with any gambling debts. The boss seemed to be considering both options. "The girl's father might pay something to get her back," he said. "Maybe not 50,000, but enough to make this worth our time." Sarah realized that even though she was innocent, these men weren't planning to let her go anytime soon. She had to find a way to escape before they moved her somewhere even more remote. The mine cart was positioned near the entrance to the old mining tunnels. Sarah had noticed that the tracks extended far back into the mountain, disappearing into darkness. If she could somehow get the cart moving, maybe she could escape through the tunnels and find another way out. But first, she had to get free from the ropes. On the third day, Sarah noticed that one of the metal rings holding her rope was loose. The bolt holding it to the cart had started to rust through over the years. She began working on it whenever the men weren't watching, using her fingernails to scrape away more rust. The work was slow and painful. Her fingers became raw and bloody, but the ring gradually became looser. She had to be careful not to make noise that would alert her captors. The men had settled into a routine. The leader usually stayed in the main building, making phone calls and giving orders. The other two took turns watching Sarah and exploring the old mine buildings, looking for anything valuable they could take. Sarah learned their names by listening to their conversations. The leader was called Rex, and he seemed to be the smartest of the three. The other men were brothers named Tommy and Jake. They complained constantly about being stuck at the mine instead of being in town where the action was. "This place gives me the creeps," Tommy said during one of his guard shifts. "All these old tunnels and machines. What if something's living down there?" "Don't be such a baby," Jake replied. "There's nothing in those tunnels except bats and rocks." But Sarah had been listening carefully to the sounds coming from the mining tunnels, and she wasn't so sure Jake was right. Sometimes she heard noises that didn't sound like bats or settling rocks. They sounded more like footsteps or voices far off in the distance. On the fourth day, Rex received a phone call that changed everything. "What do you mean the real Stuart Mitchell disappeared?" he shouted into his phone. "How can someone just disappear when he owes us 50 grand? Sarah listened as Rex learned that the man they had originally been after had left town suddenly, probably because he knew they were coming for him. Now they were stuck with the wrong hostage and no way to collect the money they were owed. "We're cutting our losses," Rex told Tommy and Jake. "Pack up everything we can carry. We're moving out tomorrow morning." "What about the girl?" Jake asked. Rex was quiet for a long moment. Sarah held her breath, afraid to hear his answer. "She can't identify us to the police if she's not around to talk," he finally said. Sarah felt cold terror wash over her. These men were planning to kill her and leave her body in the abandoned mine, where no one would ever find her. That night she worked frantically on the loose metal ring. Her fingers were bleeding badly, but she finally managed to pull the bolt completely free. Now she could slip the rope off that side of the cart, though her other hand was still tied securely. She forced herself to wait until she heard all three men snoring in the next room. Then she carefully worked her way out of the cart, moving as quietly as possible. The mine cart was still connected to her by one rope, but Sarah thought she might be able to push it down the tracks into the tunnels. If she could get far enough into the mine, maybe she could find another exit, or at least hide until the men gave up looking for her. The cart was heavier than she expected, but years of rust had made the wheels move more easily on the old tracks. Sarah put all her weight behind it and managed to get it rolling slowly toward the tunnel entrance. Just as the cart began to pick up speed on the slight downward slope, Sarah heard Rex's voice behind her. "Hey, the girl's getting away!" She heard footsteps running across the concrete floor and knew she only had seconds before they caught her. Sarah jumped into the moving cart and tried to make herself as small as possible as it rolled into the darkness of the tunnel. "Grab whatever you can! We're leaving!" Rex shouted to the other men as the sound of the cartwheels echoed off the tunnel walls. Sarah was rolling into the unknown depths of the mountain, but at least she was finally free from her captors. She had no idea where the tunnel led or how she would get out, but anything was better than staying with men who planned to kill her. The cart picked up speed as it rolled deeper into the mine, and Sarah held on tight as the darkness swallowed her up. Behind her, she could hear Rex and his men shouting and arguing about whether to follow her into the tunnels. She was on her own now, somewhere deep inside the mountain, with only one hand free and no idea how to get home. But for the first time in 4 days, Sarah Mitchell felt like she might actually survive this nightmare. The real adventure was just beginning. The minecart rolled through the darkness like a runaway train, carrying Sarah deeper into the mountain than she had ever imagined possible. The tunnel walls rushed past her in complete blackness, and she could only tell she was moving by the sound of the wheels on the old tracks and the wind rushing through her hair. Sarah tried to use her free hand to slow the cart down, but there was nothing to grab onto except the smooth metal sides. The track continued to slope downward, and the cart kept gaining speed. She pressed her feet against the front of the cart and leaned back, hoping to create some kind of brake, but it barely made a difference. After what felt like 10 minutes of rolling through the dark, the cart finally began to slow down as the track leveled out. Sarah could hear water dripping somewhere nearby, and the air felt different, cooler and more humid than it had been near the entrance. When the cart finally stopped, Sarah sat in complete silence, trying to listen for any sounds of pursuit. She could hear her own heart beating and the distant sound of water, but nothing else. The darkness around her was so complete that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. Sarah carefully climbed out of the cart, keeping one hand on it so she wouldn't lose her bearings. The ground under her feet felt rough and uneven, covered with loose rocks and dirt. She reached out with her free hand and touched a wall made of rough stone. The rope was still tied around her left wrist, connecting her to the mine cart. Sarah tried to untie it with one hand, but the knots were too tight. She would have to find another way to cut it or break free. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, Sarah began to make out faint shapes around her. The tunnel seemed to continue in both directions, and there were several other passages leading off to the sides. She had entered some kind of junction deep in the mine. Sarah decided to follow the main tunnel, thinking it would be more likely to lead to another exit. She pushed the cart along slowly, using it as a guide and support in the darkness. The wheels made small clicking sounds on the tracks, but she hoped they weren't loud enough to alert her captors if they had followed her into the mine. After walking for about 20 minutes, Sarah saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There was a faint glow coming from somewhere ahead of her, like the light from a candle or lantern. She stopped the cart and listened carefully. She could hear voices. Sarah crept forward quietly, leaving the cart behind. As she got closer to the light, she realized it was coming from a side passage that branched off from the main tunnel. She pressed herself against the wall and peered around the corner. What she saw confused her completely. There were 4 people sitting around a small campfire in a natural cavern. They looked like they had been living there for some time. Their clothes were dirty and worn, and they had sleeping bags and supplies scattered around the cave. One of the people was a woman about Sarah's age with long brown hair. The others were men of different ages, including one who looked like he could be somebody's grandfather. "I'm telling you, we can't stay here much longer," the woman was saying. "Those men upstairs are getting more suspicious. It's only a matter of time before they figure out we're down here." The older man shook his head. "Where else can we go? The police think we're dead. Our families have given up looking for us. This mine is the only safe place we have. Sarah realized she was looking at other people who had been kidnapped, just like her. But instead of being held captive, they seemed to have found a way to live hidden in the mine tunnels. She stepped out from behind the wall, and all 4 people immediately turned to look at her. The woman grabbed a knife from beside the fire. "Who are you?" she demanded. "How did you find us?" "Please don't hurt me," Sarah said, raising her free hand. "I'm not with the men upstairs. They kidnapped me too." The older man stood up and walked closer to Sarah, studying her face in the firelight. "You're the girl they brought in 4 days ago. We heard them talking about you." Sarah nodded. "I escaped in a minecart. Are you all prisoners too?" The woman lowered her knife, but kept watching Sarah carefully. "We were prisoners. Now we're survivors. My name is Lisa Chen. I've been down here for 3 months." Lisa introduced Sarah to the other 3 men. The older man was called Frank, and he had been in the mine the longest, almost 2 years. The other 2 were David and Miguel, who had been kidnapped at different times over the past year. "The same gang took all of us," Frank explained. "Different reasons each time. Sometimes for ransom, sometimes because of debts, sometimes just because we were in the wrong place at the wrong time." "But how are you surviving down here?" Sarah asked. "What do you eat? Where do you get water?" David pointed toward the back of the cavern. "There's an underground stream back there. The water is clean and cold, and we've been stockpiling food and supplies whenever we can sneak upstairs." "The mine has dozens of tunnels and caves," Miguel added. "Most of them connect to each other. We know these passages better than anyone now. We can move around without being seen." Lisa sat back down by the fire. "The problem is we can't leave. Rex and his men have people watching the roads out of town. They think we're dead, which is the only reason they stopped looking for us. If we show up again, they'll just capture us again or worse." Sarah felt hope and despair at the same time. She had found other people, but they were just as trapped as she was. "What about the police?" she asked. "Can't we signal them somehow?" Frank laughed bitterly. "The police think we're missing persons who probably ran away or died in accidents. Rex has been very careful to make our disappearances look natural. No ransom notes, no obvious crimes, just people who vanished without a trace." "But my parents will be looking for me," Sarah said. "They'll know something is wrong." "Of course they will," Lisa said gently. "But Rex is smart. He'll probably make it look like you ran away or had an accident. Maybe stage a car crash or leave some clothes by the river." Sarah realized that Lisa was right. Her parents would search for her, but if Rex was as clever as the others said, he would make sure the search went in the wrong direction. "So we just stay down here forever?" Sarah asked. "We're working on a plan," David said. "There are some old mining tunnels that lead to the other side of the mountain. If we can clear away enough rocks and debris, we might be able to get out that way." Frank pointed to a pile of tools in the corner of the cavern. "We've been working on it for months, but it's slow going. We can only work when Rex's men aren't around, and we have to be very quiet." "Show me," Sarah said. The group led Sarah through a narrow passage to another part of the mine. Here, they had been digging and clearing rocks from what looked like a collapsed tunnel. Sarah could see they had made some progress, but there was still a lot of work to do. "We think this tunnel connects to the old Jefferson mine on the other side of the mountain," Miguel explained. "That mine has been abandoned for even longer than this one, but some of the entrances might still be open." "How much more work do you think it will take?" Sarah asked. "Maybe 2 more months if we're lucky," Frank said. "But we need to be careful. If we cause a cave-in or make too much noise, Rex and his men will find us for sure." As they walked back toward the cavern with the fire, Sarah heard a sound that made everyone freeze. It was the distant echo of voices and footsteps coming from the direction of the mine entrance. "They're coming," Lisa whispered. "Rex must have decided to follow you after all." The group moved quickly to put out the fire and gather their most important supplies. Sarah could hear the voices getting closer, echoing off the tunnel walls. "This way," Frank whispered, leading them toward a narrow passage that Sarah hadn't noticed before. They crawled through the tight space one by one, with Sarah going last. Behind them, she could hear Rex's voice echoing through the tunnels. "I know you're down here somewhere," he shouted. "You can't hide forever. These tunnels don't go on forever." But Rex was wrong about that. The mine was much larger and more complicated than he realized. The group had been mapping the tunnels for months, and they knew dozens of hiding places and alternate routes. They emerged from the narrow passage into another large cavern, this one with multiple exits. Frank led them to a small alcove hidden behind a natural rock formation where they could rest and listen. Sarah could hear Rex's men spreading out through the tunnels, their flashlight beams dancing off the walls. They were making a lot of noise and didn't seem to know where they were going. "They'll give up soon," Lisa whispered. "They don't know these tunnels like we do, and they're afraid of getting lost." Sure enough, after about an hour of searching, the voices began to fade away. Rex and his men were returning to the upper level of the mine. "We need to assume they'll be watching the entrance more carefully now," Frank said. "That means we can't go upstairs for supplies anymore. And we need to work faster on clearing that tunnel," David added. "This place isn't safe anymore." Sarah felt guilty that her escape had brought Rex and his men into the tunnels, endangering the other survivors. But Lisa seemed to read her thoughts. "You did the right thing," she said. "We couldn't stay hidden forever anyway. At least now we know they're on to us, so we can plan accordingly." Over the next few hours, the group explained their survival system to Sarah. They had established a complex network of hidden supply caches throughout the mine, connected by passages that Rex's men didn't know about. They had also figured out how to tap into an underground stream for water and had even rigged up a simple ventilation system. "The hardest part is staying sane," Miguel admitted. "Being trapped underground for months, never seeing the sun or breathing fresh air. Some days I wonder if we should just take our chances and try to escape through the main entrance." "That's exactly what Rex wants us to think," Frank said firmly. "The moment we show ourselves, we're dead." "Our only chance is to finish the tunnel to the other side of the mountain?" Sarah asked to see their progress on the tunnel project. The group had been working systematically to clear away rocks and debris, but it was dangerous work. One wrong move could cause a cave-in that would trap them permanently. "We take turns working in pairs," Lisa explained. "One person digs while the other watches for signs of instability. We've had a few close calls, but so far we've been lucky." Sarah volunteered to help with the digging, but Frank shook his head. "You need to rest and get your strength back. Besides, you're still tied to that mine cart. We need to figure out how to get that rope off your wrist." David produced a small knife and carefully began cutting through the rope that connected Sarah to the cart. It took several minutes of careful work, but finally Sarah was completely free for the first time in days. "Thank you," she said, rubbing her wrist where the rope had been cutting into her skin. As the group settled down to rest, Sarah realized that even though she had escaped from Rex and his men, she was still trapped deep underground with no clear way out. But at least now she wasn't alone, and she had people who understood what she was going through. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of voices echoing through the tunnels again. Rex and his men had returned, and this time they sounded more organized and determined. "They're setting up some kind of base camp near the entrance," Lisa reported after scouting the upper tunnels. "It looks like they're planning to search the mine systematically until they find us." Frank gathered the group together. "This changes everything. We can't wait 2 months to finish the tunnel. We need to get out of here now, even if it means taking bigger risks." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Frank looked grim. "We're going to try to break through to the other side of the mountain in the next few days, even if it means working around the clock. It's dangerous, but staying here is becoming more dangerous." Sarah realized that her escape had forced everyone into a desperate situation. Now all 5 of them would have to bet their lives on a dangerous tunnel that might not even lead to freedom. But as she looked around at her new companions, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since her kidnapping began. Hope. These people had survived for months in impossible conditions, and they weren't giving up. Neither would she. The next 3 days became a race against time. While Rex and his men systematically searched the upper tunnels, Sarah and her new companions worked desperately to break through the collapsed passage that they hoped would lead to freedom. They established a rotation system where 2 people worked on digging while the other 3 rested or kept watch. Sarah quickly learned how dangerous the work was. The tunnel ceiling was supported by old wooden beams that creaked ominously every time they moved rocks. One wrong move could bring tons of stone crashing down on top of them. "The good news is we're making progress," Frank said during a brief rest break on the 2nd day. "I can feel air movement coming from the other side of the rockfall. That means there's definitely an opening beyond this debris." "The bad news," David added, "is that Rex's men are getting closer. They found our old campsite yesterday, and they're starting to map out the tunnel system." Sarah had volunteered for the most dangerous job of crawling into the narrow space they had cleared and working to remove rocks from the tightest part of the blockage. Her smaller size made her the best choice for squeezing through spaces where the bigger men couldn't fit. "I can see light," Sarah called back excitedly during her shift on the 3rd day. "There's definitely daylight coming through from the other side." Lisa crawled in beside her to look. "You're right. We're almost through. Maybe one more day of work and we'll have a passage big enough to crawl through." But their celebration was cut short by the sound of voices echoing through the tunnels behind them. Rex's search teams were getting very close to their current location. "We need to speed this up," Miguel said urgently. "They're going to find us before we can finish the tunnel." Frank made a difficult decision. "We're going to have to take a bigger risk. Instead of carefully removing rocks one at a time, we need to try to blast through the rest of the blockage." "With what?" Sarah asked. "We don't have any explosives." "We don't need explosives," Frank replied. "The rockfall is held in place by just a few key stones. If we can knock out the right ones, the whole thing should collapse in a controlled way. But it's dangerous. If we choose wrong, we could bring down the whole tunnel." Frank had worked in mines for 30 years before his kidnapping, so the others trusted his judgment. He studied the rockfall carefully, looking for the stones that were bearing the most weight. "There," he said, pointing to 3 large rocks near the middle of the pile. "Those are the keystones. If we can move those 3, everything else should slide down and open up the passage." "And if you're wrong?" Lisa asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Then we're probably all going to die down here." They could hear Rex's men getting closer, their voices and flashlight beams creating an eerie moving glow in the distant tunnels. There was no more time for careful consideration. "Let's do it," Sarah said. "I'd rather die trying to escape than let Rex capture us again." The 5 survivors worked together to position themselves around the 3 key stones. Frank counted down from 3, and they all pushed at the same time. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a grinding sound as the rocks began to shift. Suddenly, the entire rockfall started to move, stones tumbling and sliding as the pile collapsed in on itself. Sarah threw herself backward as rocks crashed down where she had been standing just seconds before. Dust filled the air, making it impossible to see or breathe properly. When the noise stopped and the dust began to settle, they could see that their plan had worked. The collapsed rocks had opened up a passage large enough for a person to crawl through, and bright daylight was streaming in from the other side. "We did it!" David shouted, but Frank quickly hushed him. "Keep your voice down," he warned. "The noise probably alerted Rex's men to our location. We need to get through this passage right now." One by one, the survivors crawled through the opening. Sarah went first. squeezing through the narrow space between the rocks and emerging into brilliant sunlight that made her eyes water after days in the dark mine. She found herself on a hillside covered with pine trees. The Jefferson mine was indeed on the other side of the mountain, just as Frank had predicted. Better yet, she could see a road winding down the hill toward what looked like a small town in the distance. Lisa emerged next, followed by David and Miguel. Frank was the last to come through, and just as he pulled his legs clear of the passage, they heard Rex's angry voice echoing from inside the tunnel. "They broke through to the other side. Tommy, you and Jake circle around the mountain in the truck. Don't let them reach town." "We need to move fast," Frank said. "Rex knows this area as well as we do. He'll have people at that town within an hour." The group started running down the hillside toward the road. Sarah's legs felt weak after days of limited movement, but adrenaline kept her going. They had come too far to give up now. When they reached the road, they had to make a quick decision about which direction to go. The town was to the left, but Rex's men would be expecting them to head that way. To the right, the road led into deep forest with no obvious destination. "I say we go right," Lisa said. "Get as far away from here as possible before we try to find help." Frank shook his head. "We need to get to people as quickly as possible. Rex won't try anything in a crowded place. The town is our best bet." Before they could decide, they heard the sound of a truck engine coming up the road from the direction of the town. Rex had been faster than they expected. "Into the trees!" Frank ordered. The group scrambled off the road and hid behind a cluster of large pine trees. Through the branches, they watched as Rex's truck came into view. Tommy was driving while Rex scanned the forest with binoculars. The truck stopped right where they had been standing just moments before. Rex got out and examined the ground carefully. "They came through here," he said to Tommy. "Fresh footprints leading down from the mine. They can't be far ahead of us." Sarah held her breath as Rex walked within 10 feet of their hiding place. If he looked in the right direction, he would see them for sure. But after a few minutes, Rex climbed back into the truck. "They must have kept going toward town. Let's catch them before they can talk to anyone." The truck sped away, leaving the survivors hidden in the forest. "That was too close," Miguel whispered. "And it's not over yet," Frank replied. "Rex will figure out that we didn't make it to town, and then he'll come back here to look for us." Sarah had an idea. "What if we split up? Some of us go toward town while others go the opposite direction. That way at least some of us have a chance to escape." Lisa shook her head. "We've survived this long by sticking together. I'm not leaving anyone behind now." David pointed deeper into the forest. "There's another option. I grew up around here before my family moved away. If I remember correctly, there's an old logging camp about 5 miles through those woods. It's been abandoned for years, but it might have a radio or telephone we could use." 5 miles through thick forest while being hunted by armed men?" Frank asked. "That's not exactly a safe option either." "None of our options are safe," Sarah pointed out. "But at least in the forest we can hide and move without being seen from the road." The group decided to try for the logging camp. They set off through the dense pine forest, staying off any trails that Rex's men might use to track them. The hiking was difficult. The forest floor was covered with fallen logs and thick underbrush that caught at their clothes and slowed them down. Sarah's wedding dress, already torn and dirty from her time in the mine, became completely ruined as she pushed through thorny bushes and climbed over fallen trees. After 2 hours of hiking, they heard the sound of truck engines and shouting voices behind them. Rex had returned to search the forest, and he had brought more men with him. "They're spreading out to search the whole area," Lisa observed, looking back through the trees. "We need to move faster." But moving faster meant making more noise, and the sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves carried further than they liked in the quiet forest. "There!" they heard someone shout in the distance. "I see movement over there." The search teams were getting closer. David led them off their direct route toward the logging camp, taking them through a rocky area where they would leave fewer tracks. "The camp should be just over that ridge," he said, pointing to a hill covered with especially thick trees. They climbed the ridge as quietly as possible, staying low to avoid being seen. At the top, they could look down into a valley where the old logging camp sat beside a small lake. The camp was more run down than David had remembered. Most of the buildings had collapsed roofs, and the equipment was covered with rust. But there was one small building that looked like it might still have its roof intact. "That looks like it might have been the communication center," Frank said. "If we're lucky, there might be some kind of working radio or phone inside." They made their way down to the camp, constantly listening for sounds of pursuit. The building Frank had pointed out was locked, but David found a window that was broken enough to climb through. Inside, they found what they were looking for. An old radio set sat on a table covered with dust and spider webs. Frank, who knew about electronics from his mining work, began checking the connections. "The radio looks like it might work," he said, "but we need power. The camp's electrical system has been dead for years." David found an old hand-crank generator in the corner of the room. "This might do it. If we can get this generator working, it should provide enough power to operate the radio." Working together, they managed to get the generator turning. Frank connected it to the radio and began trying to tune in a signal. Static crackled from the radio speakers, and then they heard a voice. "Highway Patrol Dispatch. Anyone needing emergency assistance, please respond." Frank grabbed the microphone. "This is an emergency. We have 5 kidnapping victims who escaped from criminals near Cedar Falls. We need immediate police assistance at the old Jefferson logging camp." "Roger that," the radio voice responded. "Can you provide more details about your location and the suspects?" Frank quickly explained their situation, giving descriptions of Rex and his men and the location of the mine where they had been held. The dispatcher promised to send units immediately. "Help is coming," Frank announced to the group. "But it's going to take them at least an hour to reach this location. We need to stay hidden until they arrive." Just as Frank finished speaking, they heard voices outside the building. "Check every building," Rex's voice called out. "They have to be here somewhere. Their tracks led straight to this camp." Sarah and her companions quickly turned off the radio and hid behind overturned furniture. Through the broken window, they could see Rex and at least 6 other men spreading out through the abandoned camp. For the next 45 minutes, they stayed perfectly still while Rex's men searched the buildings around them. Twice, someone came to the door of their hiding place and rattled the handle, but the lock held and no one tried to break in. Finally, they heard the sound they had been waiting for: helicopter blades beating the air above the camp. "This is the state police!" a voice announced through a loudspeaker. "All armed suspects, drop your weapons immediately!" Through the window, they watched Rex and his men look up at the helicopter in confusion and panic. Several police cars were also approaching the camp from multiple directions. Rex made a desperate decision. "Everyone scatter! Meet at the backup location if you can." His men dropped their weapons and ran in different directions into the forest. Rex himself headed toward the lake, probably hoping to escape by swimming across it. But the police were well prepared. They had surrounded the entire area, and within minutes, all of Rex's men were in custody. Rex himself was caught trying to hide in the reeds at the edge of the lake. Sarah and her companions emerged from the building and identified themselves to the police officers. For the first time in days, Sarah felt completely safe. The next few hours were a blur of medical examinations, police interviews, and emotional phone calls to family members. Sarah's parents drove to the police station and cried when they saw her walking toward them, dirty and exhausted, but alive. "We thought you were dead," her mother said, hugging her tightly. "They found your car by the river with the door open. The police said you might have drowned." Sarah realized that Rex had indeed tried to stage her disappearance to look like an accident, just as the other survivors had predicted. In the following weeks, the full extent of Rex's criminal operation became clear. He had been kidnapping people for over 3 years, sometimes for ransom, and sometimes just to eliminate witnesses to other crimes. The mine had been his base of operations, and he had assumed that people who disappeared there would never be found. Frank, Lisa, David, and Miguel were all reunited with their families. They had been declared dead by the authorities, so their returns created joyful reunions, but also complicated legal situations that took months to resolve. Sarah found it difficult to readjust to normal life. Her experience in the mine had changed her perspective on many things. Simple pleasures like hot showers, comfortable beds, and meals with her family meant more to her than they ever had before. She also stayed in touch with the other survivors. The bond they had formed during their time underground was stronger than any friendship she had ever experienced. They understood what she had been through in a way that even her family couldn't. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the entrance to the abandoned mine where her ordeal had begun. The police had sealed it off after Rex's arrest, but she had gotten permission to visit one final time. Frank, Lisa, David, and Miguel were with her. They had all wanted to see the place where they had fought so hard for their freedom. "It's strange being back here," Lisa said. "I never thought I'd want to see this place again." "But we survived," Frank pointed out. "All of us. That's something to be proud of." Sarah looked at the old mine buildings and remembered the terror she had felt when Rex's men first brought her here. But she also remembered the hope she had discovered when she found the other survivors and the determination they had all shown in digging their way to freedom. "We did more than survive," she said. "We saved each other." As the group walked back toward their cars, Sarah realized that her wedding dress, which she had finally thrown away after months of trying to clean it, had been the last thing connecting her to her old life. The person who had been dragged from her bedroom that morning was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, someone who understood the value of friendship and courage, and someone who would never take freedom for granted again. Rex and his men were sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy. The mine was eventually filled in and sealed permanently, and Sarah Mitchell, along with Frank, Lisa, David, and Miguel, went on to live the lives they had fought so hard to reclaim. The story of their escape became legendary in Cedar Falls and the surrounding towns. People called it a miracle that 5 people had managed to survive so long underground and find their way to freedom. But Sarah knew it wasn't really a miracle. It was the result of ordinary people refusing to give up hope, even in the darkest circumstances. And sometimes, that refusal to surrender was the most powerful force in the world.